Welcome to the Ottawa Business Journal's live broadcast of Terminations, Do's and Don'ts, Best Practices for Employers. I'm Michael Curran from the Ottawa Business Journal, and thank you for joining us today. Before we get into today's important topic, let me point out this virtual event is part of a series produced by OBJ and Eamon Harnden. There are more than a dozen videos on demand designed to help employees navigate these challenging employment law waters. And these are videos that are informative, available on the OBJ YouTube channel. Just Google OBJ YouTube, click the playlist, and look for a playlist that is entitled Employment Law with Eamon Harnden. All right, as mentioned, today's topic is about employment terminations. And let's just acknowledge off the top, that's a bit of a tough issue for both employers and employees. Uh, uh, Kind of surrounded by lots of emotional issues, but also some technical legal issues. Our goal here today is to provide you with an overview of how to conduct terminations while minimizing the legal risks. The discussion will cover common issues related to employee terminations. Here's a couple of things we'll touch on today. What are the key elements of considering prior to termination? How to prepare the letter of termination and what should be included, and how to effectively conduct a termination meeting. Okay, it's time to meet our guest today. As mentioned, she is part of a team of legal experts from Eamon Harnden LLP. Founded in 1987, Eamon Harnden has the largest group of lawyers specializing in labor and employment law in the National Capital Region. Here is our guest. Please welcome Samara Belitsky. Hello, Samara.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for
Thanks.
having me, and thank you very much for the introduction.
No, it's entirely my pleasure. As I mentioned, Samara, this is we should just acknowledge this right off the top. This is a bit of a tough subject. I've been in business and entrepreneur for lots of years, and kind of a reality of business is that sometimes you will need to terminate people. So entrepreneurs and employers, but also managers get very kind of uptight about these issues. There's lots of emotions, and it's difficult. Let's acknowledge too for employees. Any thoughts on this topic before the sensitivity, I guess, on this topic as we kick things off?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, Michael. It's a stressful time for everybody, right? It's very stressful for the employee who's being let go. It's very emotional for them, of course. We know as much that's obvious, but it can also be stressful and anxiety inducing for the employer as well, or for the employer representatives who are actually carrying out the termination. And so it's kind of a very emotionally charged situation, and on top of kind of the legal issues that can be nerve wracking for both employers and employees, there is that emotional aspect to it as well. And so that's why it's so important as an employer to make sure that you're preparing properly, and you know what you're doing when that time does come.
Yeah, it's a good point. And when that time does come, because all of those emotions are there, it's really important to have a game plan and stick with the game plan and not kind of go off. That's probably something that we will touch on today, but it's something kind of almost from a strategic perspective. Samara, I presume you say like stick to the plan, don't waver.
That's right. It's just like anything in life. In terms of a termination, as an employer, you want to make sure that you're preparing ahead of time, planning in advance as much as possible, and being organized with respect to carrying out the termination, such that sometimes things happen, surprises might come up, but generally speaking, if you are organized ahead of time and you stick to the plan, the termination will go as smoothly as possible for both the employer and the employee.
And you're going to give us in the next few minutes some great advice here, but there's an important caveat that you wanted to deliver right off the bat.
Yes, so I just wanted to note right at the outset that for the purposes of our discussion today, we will be talking about non unionized workforces and workplaces. And so we're dealing with employers whose employees are not unionized. And if you are watching and you're an employer who does have a unionized workforce, a lot of what we're talking about may be applicable and may be helpful to you, but you should also be mindful of the fact that there are different obligations for employers under your respective collective agreement. So just keep that in mind as we go through each of these topics.
Super important. Okay, let's take a look at our agenda. As we often do, we've divided today's show into three different topics. The first topic is going to be the one that has the most legal meat to it, the most legal details. It's what should employers consider prior to termination. So that's That's kind of the foundation of everything we're going to talk about. In topic number 2, we'll speak about how to prepare the letter of termination, important advanced planning measure. And in topic number 3, how to conduct the termination meeting. As I said, that's kind of the sticking to the game plan component. Sometime around 12:25 for our live audience, we'll be going to you. This is a unique opportunity to ask a question of one of Ottawa's leading employment law firms. So I encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity. So whether you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, you can ask the question, and Susan on our technical team will be looking for those. So please get interactive. Samara, let's move on to our first topic without any further ado. Topic number 1 is, what should employers consider prior to termination?
So, this topic is arguably the most important topic of what we'll discuss today. The first consideration as an employer, you're thinking about letting somebody go, very serious decision to be made. The first thing that you're going to want to consider is the termination for cause or without cause? We hear these terms a lot. There's a lot of misconceptions surrounding terminations for cause. So, the first item we're going to address today is, what is a termination for cause? Now, when we're dealing with terminations for cause, it's always going to be justified on the basis of employee misconduct. So there cannot be a termination for cause where there's no employee misconduct. The question is, does that employee misconduct rise to the very high level and meet that very high threshold that it would need to in order to justify a termination for cause? And so when we're dealing with these things, what's important to note is that there's actually two types of terminations for cause. The first is a termination for cause under the Employment Standards Act, which is going to have a very, very high threshold, the highest threshold in employment law, because that's where a termination for cause under the Employment Standards Act will mean that the employee who engaged in that misconduct will not be entitled to any notice or pay in lieu or termination pay. They're let go without any entitlements. And so, in that situation, an employee will have to have engaged in very serious, very willful misconduct or disobedience. Conversely, when we're dealing with termination for cause at common law, which is the other type of termination for cause, that's where there still has to be very serious employee misconduct, but it doesn't have to quite rise to the same level as the highest threshold under the Employment Standards Act. And so, for a termination for cause at common law, where there is that misconduct that could justify that termination for cause, the employee will be entitled to only their entitlements under the Employment Standards Act, and that's it. And so there is a slight difference between those two types of terminations. And there is no, unfortunately, there's no kind of golden rule or rule of thumb where we can say, you know, specifically something is cause, something is not cause. But what I can say is that it is a very high threshold, whether we're dealing with the Employment Standards Act threshold or the common law threshold. And every scenario of cause will necessarily have to include the employee intentionally violating an essential term of their employment contract, such that that conduct leads to a breach of trust, and that trust that would otherwise be necessary to maintain the employment relationship. And so, as a result of that misconduct, as a result of what the employee has done, the employment relationship just simply cannot continue. And there's no other alternative. There's no other implementation of discipline that could address the situation. The employment relationship has to come to an end. And so, when we're dealing with terminations, as an employer, you will have to determine whether there is cause or not. The vast majority of terminations will be without cause terminations. So it's really only in situations where there is misconduct at play, that there might be justification for a termination for cause. On that point, I always recommend checking in with an employment lawyer because it is a very detailed legal analysis and it is a very high threshold that the employer has to meet. Not an impossible threshold, and there are situations that do justify a termination for cause, but it won't be every situation. And so when we're dealing with terminations, on the first point of determining for cause or without cause, if let's say there isn't enough to justify a cause termination, there may be performance issues, there may be some misconduct, although maybe not intentional, then it's a termination without cause. Those are the only two types of terminations that exist. And so, even though as an employer, you may have very good reasons for terminating someone's employment, if it doesn't rise to that level of cause, it will be considered a without cause termination, which doesn't mean that there's no reasons. It just means that the employee will be owed their termination entitlements. Now, before we kind of move on to what those entitlements might be, there is another consideration when dealing with a termination without cause. So, as an employer, once you've determined that you will be proceeding with a termination without cause, something that you want to turn your minds to is whether the employee is on a protected leave. And when we talk about protected leaves, we're talking about leaves that are protected by the Employment Standards Act. So, for example, a parental leave or a medical leave. And generally speaking, you don't want to be terminating somebody while they're on one of those leaves or immediately after they come back from one of those leaves because it can trigger additional liability under human rights legislation. Now, having said that, there are exceptional circumstances where, as an employer, you may be able to proceed with a termination of that nature, but you do have to proceed with caution. And it would only be in exceptional circumstances where, for example, there's a mass restructuring or reorganization of the workforce, and there's a termination of maybe 20, 30 people, whatever the case may be, and the employee who's on a protected leave happens to have a position or a role that's been targeted by that restructuring. And so, in those situations, there can be exceptions where that termination can take place on a without cause basis, but there still is that potential for liability for having terminated somebody on a protected leave. So, as an employer, you want to be very, very careful when you're planning for those terminations. Check in with an employment lawyer, make sure that you're protected against that additional liability for those specific scenarios. And on that point, just getting back to the terminations without cause. So once you've determined that it's going to be a termination without cause, the next step will be to determine what it is that you're going to have to provide to the employee as a result of that termination without cause. Um, and I say have to because there are two different kind of categories here that we can discuss. One is the entitlements that have to be provided to the employee no matter what, and those will be prescribed by the Employment Standards Act. And then there may be additional amounts that could be owed to the employee or simply offered to the employee depending on the circumstances. And so when we're dealing with the first category, which is the unconditional entitlements that have to be provided to an employee no matter what, as I said before, those are prescribed by the Employment Standards Act, which outlines kind of a number of items that have to be provided to an employee when the employment is terminated on a without cause basis. And so, under the Employment Standards Act, you're looking at a few items. There is notice or pay in lieu of notice, which is calculated based solely on an employee's length of service, up to a maximum of 8 weeks. There's also statutory severance pay. So, when we're dealing with statutory severance pay, there are certain conditions under the Employment Standards Act that would have to be satisfied in order for an employer to actually have that obligation to provide statutory severance pay under the Employment Standards Act. And generally, it will be when an employee has at least 5 years of complete service and the employer's payroll is a total of $2.5 million or more. And when those conditions are met, on top of the notice or pay in lieu of notice, the employee is also owed statutory severance pay that's equivalent to 1 week per year of service, prorated for incomplete years of service, up to a maximum of 26 weeks. And so when we're dealing with these provisions, those are generally the items that you'll have to provide as an employer to an employee that are unconditional. It's also important to note under the Employment Standards Act that when we're talking about the notice period or the pay in lieu of notice, it's not just pay, it's not just the employee's salary, it's any other element of their compensation package that that employee would have received during that same period had they kept working. So, for example, if somebody has 3 years of service and they're being let go on a without cause basis, it's 3 weeks of either working notice where they keep working and everything continues, benefits, vacation accrual, etc. Or the employer can give pay in lieu of notice, but those other items that I've just mentioned would still have to continue. So that's a very important part of the Employment Standards Act in Ontario specifically, where for that period, all benefits have to continue, all vacation accrual has to continue. If there's an RSP or pension matching, that has to continue. Essentially, anything the employee would have received during that time, they have to receive unconditionally. Now, moving away from kind of what they have to receive no matter what and unconditionally, the next place that you're going to want to look to see what an employee might be owed for termination without cause is the written employment agreement, if there is one. And so, if there is a written employment agreement and the employment agreement has a termination clause, that termination clause is going to outline what that employee is owed at the time of termination. And the employer has, the discretion to have that termination clause look like basically whatever you'd like it to look like, as long as it complies with the Employment Standards Act. And so that termination clause may say that the employee receives only their minimum entitlements under the Employment Standards Act. It otherwise might say, the employee is entitled to a formula, 2 weeks per year of service, whatever the case may be. That is what will govern. Now, the caveat is the termination clause has to be enforceable. If it's not enforceable, then the employee is not limited to whatever that formula or amount might be in the termination clause. The employee will then be owed full severance and full termination entitlements at common law, which is the system that's determined by case law, by cases that are rendered by the courts. And at common law, the employee's severance is essentially based on several factors, including their age, their length of service, their position. And we look at these factors in order to get a sense of how long do we think it will take this employee to find another comparable position. And that's what will help assess the range of severance that that employee might be owed.
That's wow, Samara. First of all, that was fantastic. That was dense. You could take that, and we could do 10 webinars. There was so much value that you were passing along there, Samara. I just want to underline one things that I've noticed over the years. Speaking with entrepreneurs and that, and it is you did a good job of explaining it. The without cause and for cause, and it's almost always without cause. There, you did outline the reasons why it would be for cause, but I think sometimes people that don't have a lot of experience in HR would just assume, and you said you did a good job explaining this, that well, this person's not performing, so we should terminate them for cause. And it's like, no, that's not the way it works at all. Like, they have to have done something that is really damaging to the reputation and that. So it is quite rare, I guess, right, Samara, to have a termination for cause, unless there's a case of theft or fraud or something very severe, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, there are certain examples we can point to and we say, there's no, golden rule or rule of thumb. Certain examples we know for sure are cause, right? Theft, assault. These are very extreme examples of misconduct, which for sure would justify a termination for cause. The analysis becomes a little bit more nuanced when we're dealing with less severe, but still serious and intentional misconduct.
For sure, for sure. And that was kind of the very technical aspect. So thank you for starting us off on the right foot and trying to get a lot of those legalities in place for this next topic, which is the letter of termination. So this is a really important step as well. So we'll go to topic number 2 here. So how to prepare the letter of termination. Again, over to you, Samara.
Sure. So, we've now established you've done your prep as an employer, you've established what kind of termination it's going to be, you've established, how much an employee might be owed. And just on that topic, in terms of looking at the employment agreement, looking at the termination clause, it is a good idea to check in with a lawyer and with an employment lawyer and get legal advice on whether the clause is enforceable, whether you can rely on it, and then, what the employee's entitlements might be. And that will all be part of the preparation of the subsequent termination letter. And so when you're preparing the termination letter, um, you'll want to make sure that you include the reasons for termination. And when I say reasons for termination, you don't have to provide detailed reasons. It should be brief, it should be neutral, it shouldn't get into detail, especially if it's, performance issues. You don't want to be getting into all the things the employee did wrong. For termination for cause, it will be different, and you will want to include more of the reasoning for a cause termination because it will be based on misconduct. But for a without cause termination letter, you don't want to get into too much detail. You want to outline briefly that that the termination will be effective on a specific date. If there's working notice, you'll have an effective date in the future. If it's an immediate termination, you'll have that the date of the termination meeting as the last day of that employee's employment. And then you'll want to outline what you're providing to the employee or what you're offering the employee as part of their termination package. And so generally, best practice would be to outline what the employee's unconditional entitlements would be under the Employment Standards Act, and then outline any without prejudice or additional offer on top of their minimum entitlements that you may be offering as an employer. Now, as we mentioned before, it may be that the employee's entitlements are limited to the Employment Standards Act, but it's also possible that they could be owed more, either because it's outlined in your termination clause in your employment agreement, or because they may be owed common law. They may be owed full severance in terms of their termination entitlements. Whatever the case may be, it's very important to make sure that you are outlining exactly what the employee is owed, and then anything that's additional be conditional upon the execution of a release. Now, it's not mandatory as an employer. If, let's say, an employee's entitlements are limited to the Employment Standards Act, you don't have to offer more than that. You certainly could, and a lot of employers do. But anything above and beyond the minimum amount should be conditional on a release. And there's a few reasons for that. Um, the first reason is in terms of providing sometimes that additional assistance to an employee. If you're an employer where, let's say, the employee is only owed 3 weeks and you think, you know what, that might not get them to, a period where they're transitioning to new employment. We'd like to give more than 3 weeks and give them more of a buffer to find a new job. Great. So it helps the employee, but it also helps the employer because as an employer, employees have, depending on the type of claim they might want to make, for a human rights claim in Ontario, for example, they have 1 year. For a claim in court, they have 2 years from the date of termination. And so, as an employer, you want to have that peace of mind to make sure that you're not kind of looking over your shoulder and wondering if an employee might be filing a claim, filing a complaint against you moving forward. And even if, let's say, as an employer, you do everything right, you prepare properly, you provide or you offer what you should to the employee at the time of termination, the employee still has the possibility of filing a frivolous claim or complaint, even if, let's say, there is no liability there on behalf of the employer. As an employer, you'll still have to deal with that complaint. You'll still have to spend time and money to defend against it. And so, having that release really gives you that peace of mind of, in exchange for offering that employee more than the bare minimum that you have to give them, you're getting that peace of mind where you're not going to have to worry about that coming back in the future, even if the claim is frivolous. And so I always recommend offering more than you legally have to in order to get a release from an employee and make sure that things are concluded in kind of an as amicable as possible a way, and resolve things around the time of termination rather than things be lingering. And on the release agreement, it's important to make sure that you're giving employees at least a week to review the termination offer, have it reviewed by a lawyer if they so choose, and return the signed release. You really want to make sure that you're not pressuring an employee to sign it and send it back right away, and you're giving a reasonable period for them to review, get the advice they need, and make an informed decision.
Yeah, I like something that you said there, Samara, specifically, which is, and I've kind of followed this golden rule, which is, when you're at the letter stage and preparing the offer, really think about it as like an enticement or a bit of a negotiation. So remove your emotions from it. This is kind of strategic advice, not legal advice. And think about it. What you really want is the release executed, right? So don't bring in as an employer your kind of, well, they didn't perform well and they don't deserve this, they don't deserve. That's not part of it. What you're now trying to do is conclude the agreement and get that release signed. Is my thinking right on that, Samara?
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, it's to the benefit of both parties, right? For sure, from an employer perspective, it's about liability and protecting from liability, and trying to conclude the relationship in as positive a way as possible. And that also helps the employee, right? If you're offering the employee
Yeah.
more than you have to, it helps them along, and it also helps bring everything to kind of as positive a conclusion as possible on their end of things.
I really like that advice. I think it's spot on, absolutely. Listen, to a reminder for everyone that's with us, you can ask questions. We're going to be going to those questions in about 5 minutes or so. You can ask those questions on YouTube or LinkedIn. We've got a couple in the queue already, but coming to you next. So, Samara, we'll go to topic number 3. So, in topic number 1 was kind of the legalities, the analysis, excuse me, of the situation, what's owed to them. Topic number 2 is preparing the letter before you have the meeting. And now we're in that termination meeting, Samara, in topic number 3, how to conduct the termination meeting. And then we'll go to our live audience.
So, in general, when we're talking about the termination meeting, you've prepared your letter ahead of time. You have your termination letter and offer, you have your release, everything is ready in advance. As a best practice, and I know this is difficult in today's landscape with hybrid work, it is always better to conduct a termination meeting in person where possible. If it's possible, if it's feasible, that is the best way to do it. You have a much lower likelihood of something, contentious occurring, there being drama. The employee is likely to be less upset when there's that human connection in person. If it's not feasible, that is certainly okay. You certainly can conduct a termination meeting virtually. In today's landscape, it is done all the time, but you do have to kind of be more considerate of the fact that it is happening virtually and that human touch might not be there as much as it would be if you were conducting the meeting in person. And so, generally speaking, whether the meeting's in person or virtually, you want to make sure that you're ensuring confidentiality and privacy for that employee. It's a very stressful time. It can be very embarrassing. It can be humiliating. And so you want to make sure that that meeting is happening where no other employees can see it. Maybe that means, in a boardroom that's kind of separate from everybody else. If you're on site, if you're off site, making sure that that employee is not kind of sitting at a cubicle surrounded by their colleagues. And so each case will be different, but you will want to give thought to kind of the logistics of this to make sure that this is going to be as private as possible and reduce the level of embarrassment that could potentially come up for that employee. Um, During the termination meeting, it is also a best practice to have two representatives on behalf of the employer attend the meeting. And so, generally, you'll want to have someone from HR as well as someone from kind of the operation side of things, maybe the employee supervisor or their manager, to make sure that you have essentially two witnesses to the meeting. And you also have someone there who the employee actually knows, because if it's someone from HR, they might not have dealt with HR in their entire tenure as an employee. And so it's helpful to have kind of a familiar face at that meeting. Um, in terms of preparation, we talked about, what to do in advance. Something else you can have with you at the termination meeting is a script. And this is something that a lot of employers will use as a tool to make sure that, if something goes south, or, if, let's say, it becomes emotional for the employer representative, if things do get difficult in that meeting, you have a script that you can go back to and kind of bring you back on track. And that way you make sure you're saying the things that you want to say, that you should say, and you're hopefully avoiding the things that you shouldn't say. To that point, you also want to be taking detailed notes. And so it's not just about taking notes of what's being said or not said, it's also about the circumstances, where the meeting's is taking place, when it's taking place, what are the circumstances, is anyone around? This may seem like kind of an additional burden or unnecessary, but I can tell you that these things do sometimes come up post termination. And if you have contemporaneous notes that you've taken during the meeting, it's very easy to refer back to them in case an employee does bring up any sort of allegations of bad faith later on. And that just brings me to my last point about termination meetings. It's really important to be acting in good faith throughout the termination meeting, post termination, and making sure that you're being honest and treating the employee with, respect and decency. And so what that might mean is, putting measures in place to make sure it's not embarrassing if the employee has to go back to their desk after the meeting and collect their belongings, but other people might see that, canvassing that with the employee. Do you want to have us ship package up your belongings and ship them to you? There are different options available. Maybe it means having the termination meeting on a date where less people are in the workplace. There are different situations that call for different measures, but as an employer, these are things that you should be turning your mind to make sure that you're kind of decreasing the risk of embarrassing or humiliating the employee. And in addition to that, in the meeting, you also want to be forthcoming and honest. And as I mentioned before, you don't have to be detailed in the reasons for termination, especially for a without cause termination. You'll want to briefly touch on it, stay as neutral as possible, but you also don't want to be misleading about the reasons for termination. And a perfect example of that would be, if an employee is being terminated for performance issues, don't tell that employee that it's a restructuring to try and kind of save their feelings and not hurt their feelings. As well intentioned as that might be, it's not the truth. And if that employee sees that you're hiring for their position the next day or the next week, they're going to know that that was not honest, even though the intentions were good. And that then opens up liability for bad faith damages and for the employee to allege that as an employer, you acted in bad faith during the termination meeting, which can actually lead to an award of damages if ever it proceeded before a court. So these are the things that are really important to keep in mind when you're conducting that termination meeting.
When I've been in a situation like this, Samara, one of my goals is brevity. As you said, don't get into the details, and I'm trying to get to the offer discussion, and that's even going to be a brief discussion. But do not. A lot of these would entail poor performance. So for goodness sakes, do not get into a debate over why they're being terminated or that. Just in your head, the decision's made, and maybe even voice that I'm sorry. So if I was in a situation, the person gets a little argumentative, I would say, I'm very sorry, the decision's final on our side, let's talk about the offer. So just try to get to that part of the discussion, Samara, and don't dwell whatsoever on reasons or details. If they need to voice themselves, again, my best advice, not your legal advice, would be, I'm very sorry, we've made a final decision.
And I'll add to that as quote unquote legal advice, but yes, in situations in a termination meeting where an employee is upset, where they are asking for more details, you don't have to give more details. And
Yeah.
my advice is always focus on the future. You can say, sorry,
Yes.
it just wasn't the right fit. This is a final decision. The decision's been made. Focus on making sure they understand it's final. They can't convince anyone to reverse the decision, and then move forward. And let's focus on, okay, here's what we're offering you.
Yeah.
And so that's the best way to kind of move the meeting forward and not get stuck. And the termination script can be helpful in that regard.
I agree 100%. And we have lots of questions piling up. So I'll stop asking you questions. But the other thing that I really want to underline is the dignity, right? So again, make sure there's no emotions on your side in this meeting. Whether or not you're happy or unhappy, that's all irrelevant. You're going to treat this person with respect, with dignity, and try to conclude this relationship in the most positive way that's possible at that point. So anyway, enough of me on my soapbox here, Samara. Whoa, we have a lot of questions. Okay, so we're going to move to some of these. I'll put them on screen here, Samara. And just for all of us, Samara is seeing these questions for the first time. So do your best, Samira, to answer these. If it's not possible, answer these in 60 seconds. Then we'll just make an introduction, and you can speak with people. So the first one from Kathy Hill. Thank you, Kathy. It was the first question chronologically. How long does a company have to continue benefits for if the employee had been employed for 10 years and this is a without cause, a no cause termination? Any thoughts on that, Samara?
Sure. So, what I can tell you is unconditionally without cause termination with 10 years of service, as per the Employment Standards Act, everything needs to be continued for 8 weeks.
Okay.
So, that is black and white. If that employee potentially is owed more than what's prescribed by the Employment Standards Act, and that depends on the employment, if there's a written employment agreement or termination clause, if there is more owed, then arguably the benefits would have to be continued during that additional period as well at common law. So that's something that you'll have to, if this is, Kathy, if this is specific to an actual termination that you're contemplating, I would recommend getting in touch with me because I can advise you specifically on that employee's full termination entitlements as well.
It's a great answer. All right. The next question is from Jody Gervais, who has her CHRP. We've got a good quality audience here. Jody is asking if someone fails to meet the parameters of a last chance agreement, is that sufficient for a with cause or for cause termination? I presume when she's saying last chance agreement, it means you've gone through a performance management system, you've identified their weaknesses, you've given them opportunities to correct their behavior performance. So what are you thinking here, Samara? Is it okay? Is it sufficient for a with cause if they've not lived up to the last chance agreement?
So, caveat, going back to my caveat at the beginning of this discussion, oftentimes when we see the term last chance agreement, it's in the unionized context. And so if you're dealing with a unionized employee, I can't really address that because discipline is often addressed in the collective agreement. And so I can't unfortunately speak to that, but certainly, you could always contact us offline and we could always assist you in that regard. If it's if it's not a unionized employee and it's kind of a last chance agreement in the sense that they've been put on a performance improvement plan and you've worked with them and there is no improvement, there is a possibility that it could lead to a for cause termination, but it is not a sure thing. And that's because oftentimes performance issues, actual job performance issues, don't always justify a termination for cause. You would really have to be working with the employee to assist them in improving over quite a period of time to eventually potentially justify a termination for cause. It's more so where the employee is engaging in misconduct. It's more about their behavior or very serious intentional misconduct. If that's what kind of led to this last chance agreement, and then they've breached that and they've engaged in serious misconduct that was intentional, then you may be able to terminate for cause. But it really will be, a case by case analysis based on these specific circumstances that led to that last chance agreement.
Good stuff. A comment from YouTube. I like this question. It's on my mind too. If you terminate for restructuring, how long is it recommended that the same position cannot be filled?
So if you are so if you're terminating but you are filling the position, then it isn't restructuring. And so it
Yes.
shouldn't be communicated that way to the employee. If you're terminating because it's not the right fit or performance issues, whatever the case may be, you can terminate without cause. You can provide that reasoning to the employee, and then you could fill the position the next day if you wanted to. There is no time, there's no delay that you'd have to wait because you're being forthcoming with the employee. If it is an actual restructuring and you do communicate that to the employee as the reason for termination, and then something changes internally and you decide, oh, actually, we eliminated that role, but we really do. We need that role and we're going to reinstate that position. You do want to let some time go by so that it doesn't look like you were being dishonest with the employee at the time of termination. Having said that, as long as you're acting honestly and it wasn't you weren't tricking the employee, it truly was a restructuring at the time of termination, it just happened to change later, you will have the ability to kind of defend yourself from any sort of bad faith claims later on because you didn't act in bad faith. So I think it's really important to make sure that you're just proceeding honestly when you're going about those types of terminations.
Let me ask you a quick understanding. We're going a little long here, everyone, but let me ask you this question: Is then, and try to give you the short version if possible. Um, is there, and if someone was on leave, I got that point. If someone was on parental leave or maternity leave, uh, uh, and they need to be terminated, probably restructuring is one of the only ways they could do that. But is there any validity, or is there any rationale for including, like, you're being restructured? Like, you should be very careful about framing it as such. No?
Yes. So if let's say we're talking about a large restructuring that happens to impact an employee or two who are on a protected leave, you
Yeah.
do have to be very, very careful about proceeding with those terminations. You definitely want to have an employment lawyer involved in kind of guiding you through that. And absolutely, you will reference that in the termination letter, to be sure that this is not personal, it's not individual based, it's based on a restructuring.
Yes.
And there are other nuances that need to be taken into account, such as when the effective date of termination would actually come into play, because that would actually be after the leave. So there are things that are a little bit different when dealing with terminations for people who are on protected leaves. And as I mentioned before, as a rule of thumb, don't do it.
Yeah.
But there are certain exceptional situations where it could be something that you go forward with as an employer, but there is always additional liability there.
Yeah, and I got your point earlier about make sure you're being honest at all points, right? So don't use the word restructuring if you're trying to save someone some embarrassment or that. Oh, this one's. We'll keep going. These are really good, but we will conclude at some time in the next few minutes here. I'm sure Samara needs to eat at some point today. So this is probably a little bit in response to what I said. While I understand the value of brevity and sticking to the script for termination, I've mediated wrongful dismissal case where during discussions between the former employer and the complainant stated it would have helped if I had thought you were at least understood how devastating this was for me. What is your suggestion about the at least acknowledging that it is likely hard for them to leave? I don't know if that's a legal question or kind of a strategy question about the meeting, but take your best shot, Samara.
Sure. No, and this is something that I discuss this with a lot of employers, when we're dealing with preparing for terminations and meetings. And so this is something that, again, a termination script does help with, but just in terms of preparing for the meeting, at the outset, it's great to, stick to kind of the substance of what you're saying, but at the beginning, you'll have to kind of introduce the fact that this employee is being terminated. And so it's really at the outset of the meeting that you will set that tone of, after very careful consideration, and it was a difficult decision, but unfortunately, the company has made the difficult decision to terminate your employment on a without cause basis, assuming it's a without cause termination, for example. So it's really at the beginning of the meeting that you're setting that tone, that human angle of it, of there was a lot of careful consideration here, this was not a thoughtless decision, it's unfortunate, we understand it's difficult. So that's where you would kind of implement that type of tone and language to
Yes,
convey to the employee that this is not just a callous financial decision. You care, you understand this is difficult for them, but nevertheless, this is the decision that has been made. And then you proceed through the meeting.
yeah,
If, let's say, an employee is struggling at the meeting, let's say they're crying, let's say they, start to get upset, you can ask them if they need a few minutes. There are things you can do just on a human level to make them feel like they're supported. You can also offer, EAP or counseling. I mentioned outplacement services, or so if let's say, an employee might benefit from outplacement services or career transition services, you can offer that as part of your termination package in the letter. But you can also offer counseling or EAP services, and those are things that, again, kind of show the employee that you're trying to help them in this transitional period. So there are lots of things that you can do, but it first starts with kind of setting the tone, at the beginning of that meeting.
for sure. I think that was very well stated. Okay, Jody gets bonus points. This will be the last question. I apologize to other people, but I think this one's really interesting, and I've never considered it. If the terminated employee does not sign a release, what do you do? Do you only pay the minimum standards under ESA?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
Um, it depends on what the contract says, though. So if let's say you do have a termination clause that limits to the Employment Standards Act, then yes, you would just pay out the bare minimum. You wouldn't pay anything additional that you don't have to provide unless you receive that signed release. If, let's say, the termination clause says that they're owed more than the Employment Standards Act, and there's no mention at all in the termination clause that anything more than those entitlements would be subject to executing a release, then as an employer, you have an obligation to provide everything that's outlined in that termination clause, and you can't make it conditional upon a release. So that would be an exception where you'd have to give them what that says. But even in a situation where the termination clause says the employee is owed more than their minimum under the Employment Standards Act, I would still recommend offering even a little bit more than that at the time of termination in exchange for signing a release. And then in that scenario, those extra amounts you would not pay out unless you get the signed release back.
Again, very good advice. Listen, we're well into overtime, Samara, so we'll move directly to, but it's because there were so many questions. And again, I apologize if we couldn't get to your question. We will be sending Samara's contact information. So if you've got something burning question, you can get it to her later today. Let's move to, Samara, the key takeaways, and we'll bring that slide up. Our producer will put it on screen, and we'll begin our conclusion here.
Sure. So I think some of the questions actually led into these key takeaways. So we've covered some of this already, but just as kind of a last point, what to avoid, best practices, make sure you're preparing, make sure that you're taking the steps necessary in advance to make sure you understand exactly what the employee might be owed, getting, legal advice from an employment lawyer, and then, preparing the termination letter to outline what are their unconditional entitlements, what is it that you're offering in exchange for a release, making sure that all of that is ready, and that you understand as a business what that liability might be prior to actually having that termination become effective, prior to going to that termination meeting. um, Again, at the termination meeting, you really want to be acting in good faith, being honest, to a point. You don't need to be transparent in terms of full transparency into the reasons for termination and all of the inner workings that led to the decision to terminate, but you do have to be honest in what you do say during that meeting. And again, like I said before, it's a very, very good practice to have a release being provided to the employee, have an additional amount being offered in exchange for signing that release, because it really does help give you that peace of mind as an employer. And those extra amounts do go a long way in helping that employee to kind of move on to the next thing in a positive manner, and make the termination experience as smooth as possible.
Okay, let's bring your contact information on screen. And there you go, the phone number and an email at Eamon Harnden. And again, just restating it, we will be circulating to all of the registered. That's one of the reasons to register for these. All the registered attendees will get your contact information and the slide deck. So we appreciate that. Samara, you've done a great job. We thought this might be a popular topic, or maybe I'll reframe that, an important topic for people to be reflecting on. And it's a little bit of employment law 101, but as we saw, there's a ton of nuance and strategy and legalities to this. So thanks for walking us through that. You've done a great job, Samara.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. That was Samara Belitsky from Eamon Harnden. A reminder, you can go to OBJ's YouTube, and there's about 13, 14 of these videos on demand. Super useful if you're running a business or in an HR role. We'll begin wrapping up here. A reminder that you can visit obj.ca website every day for the latest and local business news. I highly recommend you look for the means to subscribe to our email newsletter. I know you might be thinking, why do I need another email in my inbox? It does a really good job at summarizing the local business news and keeps you up to date. Probably takes 30 seconds or so for you to scan every day. You can click the link if you need more information. Please follow us on social media, particularly LinkedIn. We're just about to hit 40,000 followers. And for those of you on YouTube, please hit the like, red subscribe, and the little bell icon. And if you do that, you'll get notified in the future for these live broadcasts. That's all the time we have for today. On behalf of Eamon Harnden, LLP, Samara Belitsky, I'm Michael Curran signing off from Ottawa Business Journal. See you. Bye bye.